Good morning and welcome to our virtual Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on enforced disappearance in Latin America. Today's hearing will provide a civil society perspective on the progress that we've seen and the challenges that remain in responding to enforced disappearance, recognized in the Rome Statute as a crime against humanity. The crime of enforced disappearance has three elements. Someone is deprived of liberty, detained, arrested, or abducted. The deprivation of liberty is at the hands of government agents or people acting with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of a government or of a state. And authorities refuse to acknowledge or conceal the whereabouts of the person so that they are removed from the protection of the law. Enforced disappearance has occurred across time in many different contexts all around the world. In recent years, this commission has received reports about forced disappearance in Syria, China, the Philippines, Turkey, and Nicaragua, just to name a few. But it's systematic and it's massive. But it's systematic and its massive use in Latin America as a strategy of political repression in the 1970s and 1980s is what put enforced disappearance on the global agenda, even leading to the emergence of "to be disappeared" as a new use of an old verb. While we still do not know for sure how many people were forcibly disappeared in the region during that era, estimates are in the tens of thousands at the hands of notoriously brutal regimes in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, El Salvador, and Guatemala, among others. Each disappeared person left behind parents, siblings, partners, friends, and colleagues. The collective pain is and has always been enormous. And for those whose whereabouts are still unknown, that pain continues through today. In January 2017, I traveled to El Salvador with a group of U.S. citizens whose relatives remain missing, disappeared from the Salvadoran Civil War. The Jesuit-run University of Central America held a conference on the disappeared, inviting relatives of the missing to attend, be present, and to speak. The auditorium was packed. People sitting in the aisles, standing room only, and everyone had a photo of their missing loved ones. Many of those holding photos were young people. They weren't even born yet when their missing relative was disappeared. But now they were taking up the vigil, the search, because their parents or grandparents had passed away or couldn't travel to San Salvador to attend the conference. And I realized that this is a wound that never heals. It is pain and emptiness that is passed down through generations. These families will never know peace until they know the truth, until they find out what happened to their family member, the story behind his or her disappearance, and if they're lucky, to find their remains, give them a proper and dignified burial, and find some closure. This reality is one reason the hearing today is focused on Latin America. The second reason is that many of the most innovative and influential responses to enforced disappearance have come from Latin America due to the unceasing efforts of victims' associations and human rights organizations. Latin Americans led the fight to define enforced disappearance and recognize it as a distinct crime. They have been at the forefront of efforts to develop new law, domestic, regional, and international, to penalize enforced disappearance and include this grave crime under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Their unceasing pursuit of legal accountability has driven the progressive development of international and domestic jurisprudence. Just as important have been the strategies to find and identify the remains of victims, to remember and honor them, to provide psychological support for the survivors, to demand access to information and insist on the truth of what happened for the benefit of families and for society as a whole. Many of these efforts have been led by women, often mothers, forced to confront something that no parent should ever have to bear. And as I saw in El Salvador, as the children of the disappeared have grown up, they have become advocates as well. But with all the progress that has been made, the work to ensure the rights of past victims of enforced disappearance is not done, and the practice has continued into the present day. Many members of Congress have followed with deep concern the disappearance of 43 students from a rural school in Ayotzinapa, which is in Mexico, in 2014. Recently, partial remains of 2 of the students were identified, But in spite of the best efforts of many, including the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, all the other students still remain disappeared. And this is one case. Last July, Mexican officials revised their estimate of the number of missing and forcibly disappeared persons in the country to more than 73,000. Only 1,500 of these persons were disappeared during the Dirty War era. Most of the other cases occurred since 2006, with the escalation of violence related to drug trafficking and the Mexican government's militarized response. So we have convened this hearing to take stock of where things stand in this fight for the rights of victims of enforced disappearance, and to ask what more we in Congress can do to support initiatives in Latin America, those that address the legacy of the past, as well as efforts to end any continued involvement by the region's governments with this terrible abuse. In the past, Congress has authorized funding for technical and forensic assistance and training, DNA databases, truth commissions, search commissions, and civil society engagement and accountability processes. I have directly led efforts to support Con Búsqueda, El Salvador's search commission. We in Congress have also called on the Trump administration to release documents relevant to solving cases of enforced disappearances, including, in my case, documents related to the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador. I believe all this support, which has often been in response to specific country situations, has been important and worthwhile. The question today is what more we can and what more should we be doing? If we could step up our efforts, if we could design a U.S. policy to respond in a comprehensive way to the crime of enforced disappearances in Latin America, what would that look like? I look forward to hearing the recommendations of our witnesses on this human rights issue that is so close to the heart of surviving family members, so important for their hopes, and so important for reconciliation throughout the region. I will now introduce our witnesses, and without objection, your complete statements will be in the record. First, Federico Andreu was an international expert on human rights and enforced disappearance, who until recently served as the high-level advisor on enforced disappearance with Colombia's unit for the search of disappeared persons. He previously worked with with the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva, and was deeply involved in advocacy and support of the UN Convention on Victims of Enforced Disappearance. Lenore Arteaga heads the program on impunity and grave human rights violations at the Due Process of Law Foundation. In February of 2018, she was appointed by the government of El Salvador as a commissioner for the National Commission for the Search of Disappeared Persons, known as Con Búsqueda. Grace Mahogany Fernandez Moran is a specialist in human rights and the sister of Dan Harimel Fernandez, who was forcibly disappeared in Coahuila State in 2008. Their family helped found Searching for the Disappeared Mexico Buscambe. Freddie Pecorelli is the director of the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala. He has more than 2 decades of experience applying forensic science and sciences to search for and identify the missing and disappeared. He has advised governmental search entities, including the National Search Commission in Mexico, Con Búsqueda in El Salvador, and the Unit for the Search of the Disappeared Persons in Colombia. I appreciate you all being here. Many of you I have worked with in the past, and I know and I admire all of your work. It is so incredibly important, and obviously we want to be very helpful, and we want to be wind at your back, and certainly we want to be supportive of the families whose loved ones are disappeared. So we'll begin with Mr. Andreu, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Maluran, and member of the Strong Lantos Human Rights Commission for the opportunity to talk about the process of this. First of all, in advance and apologize for my very poor English.
We're having a little bit of trouble hearing you, so I don't know whether we're having a tough time hearing you. I don't know what the challenge is here.
I continue or you're going?
You know what I'm gonna suggest? Let's see if we can work on your sound. Let me go to Miss. Why don't I have Miss Ortega begin, and then we'll come back to you. Okay?
Okay, perfect.
All right. Okay. All right. Lenore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good morning. Good morning, Congressman McGovern and distinguished members of the commission. And also good morning for the other experts here in this panel on behalf of the Due Process of Law Foundation and also the National Commission for the Search of Disappeared Persons in the context of the conflict in El Salvador, con la búsqueda. I would like to thank you for this opportunity to report on the progress made in the fight against impunity and the search process for victims of enforced disappearance, both in El Salvador specifically and at the Inter-American level. Throughout the last few decades and up to the present day, as you were saying, Congressman McGovern, enforced disappearance has been a widespread practice in Latin America in the context of political or criminal violence linked to the state. At the same time, the continent has also been a pioneer in state and non-state responses to these crimes, including truth commissions, trials on enforced disappearances, not-for-profit forensic anthropology teams, specialized techniques in locating disappeared children and reuniting them with their families, and the families and human rights organizations that have provided solutions and have sustained tireless fights. Latin American experiences have created innovative ways of conceptualizing and also responding to state violence, such as developing a very solid standard against disappearances and clear requirements in terms of how to investigate these crimes and how to conduct a search of the disappeared. At the same time, the Latin American record demonstrates that there is not just one model, that one size fits all model for addressing enforced disappearances. Policies and practices should follow international frameworks, but at the same time, this should respect cultural and political perspective and local meanings. The conceptualization of enforced disappearances as a complex form of human rights violation, as a complex crime, and the corresponding state duties are due largely to the Inter-American Court decisions. Since its first judgment until now, there's been around 47 cases, judgment from the Inter-American Court related to forced disappearances. So the court has established a very comprehensive and expansive jurisprudence and standards, which have greatly benefited the region. So it is very clear now that the state responsibility, one of the main state responsibilities in terms of forced disappearances, is to continue with the investigation until the fate of the disappeared person is established. However, in most countries where enforced disappearances have occurred or continue to occur, investigations, if there are any, still primarily focus on identifying perpetrators, a criminal investigation focus. As a result of this, the relatives of the families are then left with the immense burden to take on the task of searching for their loved ones by themselves. In response of these demands from families, there has been a growing demand for the emergence of state institutions or offices that conduct and support searches and identification activities as specialized institutions. So these kind of institutions have been created by law or by presidential decrees with different organizational and structural models And there are at least now 4 countries that have specialized institutions for the search: Mexico, Peru, El Salvador, and Colombia. So regarding El Salvador, its history with the enforced disappearances begin in the 70s and continue with the armed conflict that took place from 1980 to 1992. During those 12 years of the war and before that, many people were disappeared. And in 1993, the Truth Commission for El Salvador recorded approximately 5,000 cases of enforced disappearances. In addition, since then, multiple victims and human rights organizations have documented at least 8,000 incidents. So in 1993, just after the Truth Commission report was released, an amnesty law was signed, and it blocked investigations into this and other atrocities until 2016, when the Supreme Court declared the law unconstitutional. However, even though there's no legal obstacles, multiple other reasons still stand in the way of justice by national courts, not only in the Jesuit case or in El Mozote case, but in dozens of other cases that have been also filed before the Attorney General office since the end of the country's civil war. Motivated and helped by these Supreme Court decisions that invalidated the amnesty law, and after extensive work by victims' family members, including sons and daughters of the disappeared who now live in the United States and are Salvadorian American, Conabúsqueda was finally created by a presidential decree in August 2017 as a non-judicial mechanism with the mission to investigate and determine the whereabouts of the adult victims of enforced disappearance in the context of the Civil War, and facilitate their reunion with their families or the restitution of their remains. Conabúsqueda is inspired by the legacy of those who have sought recognition of the civilian victims and wishes to be part of a state that is committed to the guarantee of non-repetition of a very painful past. Conabúsqueda is currently investigating as a priority 243 enforced disappearances cases, and recently published a report, the first of its kind in El Salvador, detailing and characterizing the phenomenon of enforced disappearances in the context of the country armed conflict. Conabúsqueda has also taken the first steps toward the creation of a genetic database with the help of FAFG in Guatemala that would help to identify disappeared victims and initiating the development of a comprehensive victims registry. These are all important advances and will be vital tools in the search and identification process, but will require greater government investment and political commitment in order to be effective. And unfortunately, thus far, the political will among Salvadorian authorities to promote truth, justice, and reparation has been insufficient. So despite this progress that I was talking about, and also progress on El Mozote case criminal investigation, there continue to be grave political risks to the still very fragile transitional justice process underway in El Salvador. One such risk is evident in recent legislative initiatives. El Salvador Congress has spent the last year and a half trying to ram through a new national reconciliation law that contains its own version of a blanket amnesty law for human rights committed during the Civil War, essentially a reworking of the unconstitutional amnesty law that was repealed in 2017. So far, a strong campaign by victims and national and international civil organizations have managed to stop the law's passage, but the fight is far from over. So in terms of recommendations, first, we should support victims' demands for justice and accountability for crimes committed during the war, and in particular, forced disappearances. Now it is up to the government of El Salvador to demonstrate a continuous commitment to the search for the disappeared by providing full support for Conabúsqueda's work, including hiring the full team of technical staff, because still 2 years after Conabúsqueda first opened their doors to the public, still don't have a full technical staff, and also ensuring a sufficient budget, allowing for progress in the investigations of war crimes by the Attorney General and the sustained implementation of a reparations program will also be some of the main indicators that this country is fully, El Salvador country is fully dedicated to non-repetition and strengthening the rule of law. Second, for Conabúsqueda to be successful, El Salvador and also the United States must now take extra effort and care to preserve and make available to the Commission all government, military, intelligence, and security records and other documentations from the wartime period that might shed light or provide context to help solve the missing cases. We know that in 2019, Congress charged the State Department with coordinated a government-wide search among all federal agencies to identify and release to Salvadorian judicial authorities, including the presided judge in the Almozote case. We are very grateful to you, Congressman McGovern, and as you have also been advocating for the Department of Defense to do its part and provide these documents to Conabúsqueda and to Salvadorian judicial authorities. The failure of El Salvador's military leadership to grant access to historical records has become a huge point of disagreement with civil society and definitely must be addressed in light of the state duties. Third, the United States should continue to support and strengthen regional and international accountability mechanisms that can have an impact in El Salvador and in the region. This includes investing in providing support to the Inter-American system for human rights protection and encouraging transparency and collaboration between El Salvador and international community in addressing enforced disappearances. Finally, there are no easy solutions in dealing with this type of endemic impunity in El Salvador, and it requires a concerted effort by El Salvador government and civil society with the assistance of the international community to address this phenomenon. But definitely, Mr. Chairman, it is the position of DPLF and also Conabúsqueda that the Foundation for Peace and Reconciliation in El Salvador going forward rests on achieving truth and justice for the atrocities of the past, a commitment to redress victims of violence, and absolute respect for the human rights of all citizens. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and thank you for your excellent testimony, and thank you for your great work.
What a great first.
And I think we're going to now we're going to Grace Mahogany Fernandez Moran next. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Congressman McGovern and other members of the Lantos Human Rights Commission for the opportunity to talk about disappearances in Mexico. Even though this is not a new problem, today I'm going to talk about the very significant problem of disappearances in the context of the drugs war. My brother Dan Jeremel was 34 years old, father of 5 children, when he was forcibly disappeared by soldiers that also worked for a criminal organization named the Zetas. In 2008, at Coahuila, Mexico, but for citizens, but also for authorities, when somebody was taken by the perpetrators, didn't ask for, and they didn't ask for money, you could not say it was a kidnapping. They call it levantones, which it means to lift up. This way, authorities justified there was not a crime to investigate. We had to pay a lawyer in order to help us to force authorities to work, but they only investigate personal issues. And 3 weeks later of his disappearance, in an operation against a kidnapping ring, they found my brother's car being used by an active member of the army. A lot of irregularities happened in the investigation. A lot of information disappeared. They never linked my brother with those men involved in the kidnapping ring, although they had his car. In order to press the authorities to work, we started a collective. The biggest problem was that there were many different authorities working with the criminal organizations, as corruption was the common modus operandi of these organizations. The first collective battle we won was the classification of the forced disappearance as crime in the Code of Criminal Procedures in Coahuila. But the prosecutors didn't know how to search for or find people. They were afraid of gangs and corruption officials. Even though families risked their lives to find information for the prosecutors, most of it was dismissed. Families had information about clandestine graves, and authorities did not explore those places. Now there's 1,000 of human remains that have not been identified. More than 70 collectives of families of the disappeared as the national movement work with authorities to create the general law in the forced disappearance of persons disappeared committed by individuals and the national search system. We hope the National Search Commission could search for and find disappeared people without bureaucratic complication. And so there are more chances to rescue people, but the state have not assigned enough resources for this work. The National Search Commission has made some progress, but disappearances still occur. There are more than 75,000 disappeared people in the registry by now, and the number is going up. We just have 30 convictions at the federal level of enforced disappearance. This is more than 99.9% of impunity. Corruption and impunity make disappearance possible. Despite the hard work of the victims, families, and some authorities, criminals has been stronger than the entire government. Disappearance could not happen without the help inside the government. This is not There is not a government strategy to fight against impunity. There is not a strategy to combat this disappearance with the full power and structure of the state. The National Prosecutor's Offices has refused to do those tasks that only the prosecutors can ask. Without their cooperation, the National Commission and the state level commissions cannot get information like call records or bank account activity that is crucial for during the first 72 hours after disappearance in order to have a real chances to rescue people. In the area of forensic identification, the government of President López Obrador promised to identify most of the 37,000 unidentified human remains and hundreds of thousands of bone fragments recovered in clandestine graves. The national movement worked with the government to create the extraordinary mechanism of forensic identification to address the backlog of cases and be able to identify those people and return them to their families. The government has damaged our trust in some parts of the process. There is a lot of work to do to have answers and to really have chances to find all the disappeared people. Mexico needs a lot of help, even if the government is not always able to recognize that need. I am sure that USA can assist us by, first, continuing to support the extraordinary mechanism of forensic identification. It will need a lot of money, yes, but also forensic experts, forensic laboratories, DNA expert, technology, and infrastructure. USAID is supporting the mechanism currently, and this and other US support should continue. Second, the forensic mechanism should have access to databases about unidentified migrants who die in the US border, as they could be some of the people we are looking for. Third, in some trials in the U.S. involving drug trafficking operations like the Zetas, witnesses have testified about government involvement with the Zetas, but they also talk about people who were disappeared. They have information that can help to find our disappeared relatives, but the Mexican government hasn't requested this information. It will be important to develop a way for families to get information from people prosecuted in the US about people who were disappeared or murdered by the Zetas or another criminal groups. Four, the new US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement doesn't have a human rights clause, but US companies should care for how they invest in Mexico. It's not just a matter of labor rights, which is part of the USMCA. The companies and the governments must care about human rights for all people that live in places where have an investment. Fifth, keep human rights requirements in US assistance to Mexico, like the requirements for the Mexican government to search for victims of forced disappearance and investigating and prosecuting those responsible for such crimes. Sixth and last, provide international political pressure. Media and political pressure are some of the best instruments to make authorities address human rights. When the international community is watching for human rights, the government acts. When you ask for families to be involved, they have to involve us. When you show interest in Mexico, they worry about how to look their best. Please keep an eye on disappearances in Mexico. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about our reality. We are worried that we don't have enough life to find our disappeared relatives, obtain justice for them, and end disappearances in Mexico. This is why we need your support. We are partners, but also we are brothers and sisters of land. The help and we have both suffered the pain that drugs and violence cause. We are thankful for the help we received by USAID, the Justice Department, the State Department, and other U.S. agencies that work on human rights in Mexico. We are thankful for the engagement of the U.S. Congress on human rights in Mexico and for your concern about disappearance. Without that help, believe me, this problem could get worse. Because they were taken alive, we want them back alive, porque vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos. Gracias.
Thank you very, very, very much. I appreciate your testimony. I'll now turn to Freddie Pecorelli.
Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman McGovern. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and to my colleagues that are here today. I represent the Forensic Anthropology Foundation of Guatemala, also known as the FAFG, which is a forensic organization that applies science at the service of families to search and identify people who were disappeared. FAFG's multidisciplinary forensic system responds to the family's needs for truth, justice, and to find their loved ones. Enforced disappearances generate long-lasting negative effects on the families of the disappeared. The need for truth and dignity has driven families on an endless search with very few results. And I'm going to go off script a bit, simply because I think it's important that although most of my comments were about the region, we recognize that Guatemala is one of the few, it's the only country here that's represented that does not have a commission. There is no state mechanism and has not recognized, I don't think, even the internal armed conflict. Even though there was a truth commission, there was nothing done since. And we are one of the few countries that has to have a search process only through civil society. And that's the reason that we are forced to do every one of our investigations only as criminal investigations. And even though these searches and identification processes can be done either under the humanitarian flag or under the accountability flag, it is important to understand that the forensic process is the same. So, finding the disappeared is a long-term process that can take decades and depends on the trust of the families, access to information, proper forensic techniques, access to locations, for example, where people are held alive if they are alive, or in most cases, the graves to recover the bodies. Because these cases are so difficult to resolve, it is important to share and learn from regional and global experiences, especially on how we build trust with families, how to locate graves, how to find and use information, how to determine the cause of death, whether it be for accountability purposes or for the purpose of truth. Families want to know everything that happened to their loved one. How to extract DNA from old, damaged skeletal remains, how to structure a family reference information system, and how to involve and communicate with families. Focusing on the results, identifications is what we want. We want to be able to give these bodies back to the families. And we must understand what has worked and what has not worked. We have to also focus on creating dedicated, autonomous, focused teams, institutions, efforts, whatever you want to call them, because the numbers, as you've heard, are massive, and the problem is ongoing. Using the current traditional forensic systems has not worked. And any one of my colleagues here can tell you that, especially when just between the 4 countries that are represented here today, we add up to over 200,000 disappearances or disappeared persons. And that's if you take away all of the other effects of the conflicts. For example, in Guatemala, there were 200,000 victims. 160,000 of them are known to have been killed, and 40,000 of them are disappeared. But if you take a look at Colombia, like it was stated, over 80,000 disappeared. Mexico, over 73,000. El Salvador, over 10,000. Guatemala, over 40,000. And how many of these people have actually been found, identified, and returned to the families, even though we've been working on this for decades? So we have to really, really take account of what needs to be done to go forward. We have been very fortunate and are recently given the opportunity to work with the unit of the search for the disappeared in Colombia, con la búsqueda en El Salvador, and the CNV. And we learned that many of these search commissions must rely on local traditional forensic institutions. The limitations have proven to have a negative effect on the end result, which is meeting the family's needs. We must then question if the search commissions have what they need. Are the forensic institutions ready to answer these calls? Do they have what's necessary at their hands? Do they understand that these cases have been unsolved and unresolved for decades? and that just equipment, forensic experts, and labs do not equal identifications. Resolving these cases requires the understanding that it is one process. Search and identification is a continuous interdependent process and should not be divided. I say that because if you look at the mandates of all these recent commissions that have been created, they all have, whether they be, most of them are humanitarian, which is one thing, but they all are search commissions. And what we want to be able to do is search and identify. By creating search commissions and separating the identification portion of the process, you are now limiting their ability to actually continue on one individual process and to give families results. For example, one identification could lead to the understanding of patterns. It can lead to the hypothesis of more identification. It can lead to understanding many other things happening around one identification. Experts should be leading the decision-making process, not others like prosecutors or other lawyers. The information should be available for the experts to be able to make the decisions and follow these leads that can generate identification. There are many lessons. There is definitely a way forward, and these cases can be resolved, but we must learn from the regional and global experiences, specifically in including the families in the process and in earning their trust, and how to access and manage information and how to make it available to the experts. And including with that information is, classified information. The impact of dedicated teams focus only on these cases. How do we create teams that only do these cases and don't get pulled off of these cases because of political reasons or resources or the lack of resources? We must also include innovative technologies and, of course, the transparent, respectful, and timely communication with families. So my recommendations to Congress would be to advocate for the safe and respectful participation of families, to promote access, proper information flow, and access to classified information, to support the development of dedicated forensic teams and institutions in country, so to build local capacity for these cases specifically, to advocate for the incorporation of new technology, specifically for the search and identification of the disappeared, to allocate dedicated support and resources to search commissions, to promote and support regional and global experience sharing, not only the successes, but also let's learn from all the mistakes that we've made. And of course, support civil society organizations that accompany families and provide legal and psychosocial support, which is extremely important. And the continued support and resources to independent civil society forensic organizations, especially where there is no state-led effort. With that said, I just want to thank you, Congressman McGovern, and tell you that although there's many advances in Guatemala, we have identified over 3,500 people that were disappeared. There's still tens of thousands of people that we're searching for. And now that we're working also in Colombia and Mexico and El Salvador, it is evident that we have to create these focused forensic processes, and that we must include the families in every step of the search and of the identification, and that we're not going to be able to do it alone. And that's why I'm so glad to be able to share this panel with my colleagues, but also with yourself. And I really thank you for your support, and thank you for bringing this up into a meeting in Congress. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's testimony here. I'm being told that our friend Federico Andreu, his electricity just went out, and so we've lost his connection, and we're going to submit his testimony for the record, and I regret very much that we're having trouble connecting with him, because his testimony was also very compelling. But if we can hook up with him, his electricity goes back on, we may give him an opportunity to testify here.
Jackson needs.
And I think I have is Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee on?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes, I'm here.
do you
I'm
want
here.
to, do you have any comments you want to make, or before we go to questions?
Well, let me, yes, Mr. Chairman, and let me say that I'm very grateful that the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission is addressing this issue. As you well know, we've known of this issue of enforced uh, missing persons. You recall our colleague, former Secretary of Labor, now Commissioner in California. We talked about women in Mexico on the border being both missing and violated, numbers of young women. And so it's tragic that it is continuing as we speak. And if I might put a current item on the record, Mr. Chairman, I'm just compelled as we go into questions, so I will be brief on these comments. I'm appalled, and I want it to be on public record, of the horrific comments and denunciation of the importance of our refugee program here in the United States. When people are fleeing persecution or locked in refugee camps because of violence, that the Commander-in-Chief, President of the United States, would denigrate this humanitarian concept, as well as denigrate one of our members. Then finally, I want to make the point for the witnesses that we've been working to fight against some conditions in our immigration centers regarding women. They've heard that. And so just to let you know that as we were able to rescue a woman, that woman now is about to be taken back into custody. So I am very intensely committed to your issues, but I want you to know that we're working on many different areas to ensure a just response to this dastardly condition of enforced missing persons, if you will, and as well dealing with trying to promote humanity and human rights here in the United States of America. And I thank the chairman for yielding to me for this moment.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate all of your work on these issues. Let me first of all say, I want to thank everybody who's testified, and I want to thank you for the work that you do, which is so incredibly important. You know, one of the things that is particularly awful about enforced disappearance is that families and loved ones oftentimes don't ever know what ever happened. I mean, I talked at the beginning about my support of Conabuskada in El Salvador. I remember meeting a family who was from California, where their father and the husband of this woman was disappeared during the war, and they never knew what happened. The children believe that the father is dead. The wife is still holding out hope that maybe he's alive, or maybe he lost his memory, or he doesn't know what's going on. But the pain and the anguish and the not knowing what happened is just so cruel and awful. And it's been really puzzling to me that, especially in Latin America, after all these years, I mean, many of the people were disappeared during the 70s and 80s and early 90s. But after all these years, we're now in the year 2020. So it's been a while. Those who were in charge, those who were in the military, those who were in the security forces are either retired or they themselves have passed away. And yet there's still this reluctance to confront the truth and the reality and bring closure to these cases. Even in El Salvador right now, as we're talking about trying to get records from the government on the case of the El Mozote massacre, for example, getting information on cases that might lead you to where these graves may be. There's just this reluctance to comply and to work with organizations to help deal with this issue, and it's just so cruel, and so that is why the work that you do is so important, and that's why this hearing is important. That's why as we go through questions here, I'm going to be asking like specifically, what can we do here in Congress? What are the steps that we can take that would make a difference? What are the things that we need to fund better? What are the things we need to put pressure on these local governments to do? But one comment you could, one of the things that I think you've all referred to, and I think it's worth pointing out for the record, is that you've highlighted the importance of civil society organizations in this effort. Without those civil society organizations, we'd be nowhere right now. But let me ask this question of all of you. I mean, what role do local communities play in identifying the location of remains? How common is it that local communities know the location of remains or graves but have not shared their knowledge with authorities? Under what condition is it safe for a community to reveal what they know? And are there ways to empower and protect communities to make it possible for them to share the knowledge that they may know? Because even when we talk about crimes that happened in the 1980s, there's still great fear in communities to even talk about these things. So let me pose that question to all three of you, and whoever wants to begin. Lenore, why don't we begin with you?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Congressman McGovern. In the case of wartime forced disappearances in El Salvador, still a lot of people that are in local communities have the information about mass graves or about just where their relatives might be buried. But they are still, on one side, they're still afraid of talking with, especially with institutions. There hasn't been enough trust building, and state institutions have often failed to families, so there are trust issues. And on the other hand, many families don't have, of course, the technical expertise to do this identification, exhumations, and all that. So these processes need to take into account the information that local communities have, but also institution must help these families to do these search processes with all the technical standards. I would say those are the maybe the less complicated cases, because families have key information and they just need the forensic and technical capacity. But in most cases, especially since there are a lot of strategies to still hide any information about the remains, I would say that in most cases, families don't know, but they just saw their relatives one day and that's it. They don't know anything else. So in those cases, which are the majority, it's information that is in the hands of military members and also guerrilla members is key, right? Is key. But in any cases, institutions as Conabúsqueda, for example, must work very closely with family members, the ones that have information and the ones that don't have information, just because they need to participate and to understand every step of the process.
Yeah. And when I talk to some of these families, their interest is not in getting retribution. Their interest is in the truth, right, and bringing some closure, and wanting to have a proper burial for their loved one. Mr. Pecorelli.
Thank you, sir. Yes, the work with the communities is probably our most important work. They are the key piece to any of these investigations. And we have to, their role is different depending on which type of case we're doing. So we have basically two types. As Leonore mentioned, we'll call this the closed context identification process, which would mean we have a lot of information, and there the families sometimes know the location of the graves. They know the names of the perpetrators, and there's a lot of information. And those cases are pretty straightforward. In Guatemala, those mostly are large-scale massacres. However, in the open context identification cases, where someone just was taken either from their home, their place of work, or they were on a bus, because of a list they were on, those cases, we find most bodies in military installations, cemeteries, or clandestine graves. And in those cases, the families, those are the real disappeared, where no one knows where those people are. They don't know. They just simply don't know. And going back to what Grace said, vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos. It is the families hold on to the hope that the loved ones are alive till the second we identify the bodies. So that's an ongoing thing. And that also has played a role in limiting families coming forward for the search, because they're hoping that their loved ones are going to show up alive. So in I guess to close my answer, it would be, is it safe for the communities? They don't believe it is, because there's a lot of people in power that committed these crimes that are still in power. We must give them the information so they know how they can contribute to the search. We must empower them so they know their rights and can participate in these processes. And I'll give you an example, sir. We worked at a former military base in Comalapa, a base that the existence of this base has been denied by the Guatemalan military, specifically by the Minister of Defense. Its existence was proven because of a declassified document where the U.S. ambassador tells the State Department that he visited this military base on a state visit. We recovered 220 bodies there in 2003, and the identification process continues. In March, right before the pandemic and right before we stopped going out into the field, we took a sample from a family that we were able to get them to trust us. And we took their DNA samples, put them in our database, and within a matter of 2 months, we had identified their loved one that had been in that grave. Now remember, this person went missing in 1982. We recovered the body in 2003, and we identified him in 2020. This is how complicated it can be. And this is why the trust of the families is so important. They need to know what's happened. They need to know what's necessary, what the process is, and they need to feel trust and safe enough to be able to come forward. Sometimes that doesn't happen with state institutions in Latin America, and that's why civil society organizations are so important. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Ms. Fernandez.
Thank you. I would like to start to say that the most of the relatives that we are looking for our parents disappear, we are women. So we left the afraid but the pain at home because we love of our relatives. So that here in Mexico, even though the violence and the crime is still at the streets, and there's a lot of affair to being in the street, we decide to do not wait until the authorities do their works. So since several years ago, this collective of families started to find out these clandestine graves, and they goes to the authorities and give that information. In the first years this started to happen, authorities were kind of they didn't want to go and take out the bones on the bodies because they should make investigation. They should have to give us answers, you know. So we have to press a lot. We have to go out of the country to say Mexico is a big clandestine grave. There's a lot of people dead that was um, that the criminals organization tried to disappear the bodies also, and we need help. So by now, for families, as I said, we are looking for them alive, but we know that there's a lot of probabilities that we can find them find them dead. So as Freddie says, something that is very important, or the most important thing, is the trust. And we don't trust in the procedures, but in the authorities that have to identify them. By now, as I said, there are more than 37,000 people without identification. And a lot of the ones that were identified, after a couple years, we realized that they made the procedure wrong. So that this big collective of families, we are trying to get by now the mechanism is ready, but is still in construction. Is being building because there is just in paper, you know. The intention of this is to have a way with a lot of experts in order to be sure that the procedures are made right. We want a mechanism with in where we can trust, because if we are not sure about if it's good, it won't work. So we think the Congress must make sure that the U.S. government keeps enforced disappearance firmly on the table of its conversations with the Mexican government. Help Mexico address the crisis, which means helping the Mexican government and helping the victims and their families and their proposals and solutions. We know there's a lot of things to do, and we know that this won't be end tomorrow or in 1 year or in 10 years, maybe. But we know that if you help us to keep an eye to the government, it's easier for us to have solutions in order to give the name of those people that is waiting for so many years to return to their houses.
Right.
Talking about the deaths, but there's a lot of things to do in order to search for.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for thank all of you for your answers. I mean, I guess my, and again, every case is different, and some are situations where really nobody can tell you where the whereabouts of remains may be. But in other cases, there are people in communities who know things, but who are afraid to come forward because, there are people that still operate with impunity. They're afraid there'll be retribution. And I think that, one of the things that I, hope that the United States government will do better, and that is communicate very directly to some of these communities that feel at risk that we will help provide you protection or even relocation. If you feel your life is threatened because you may come forward and tell the truth about where a mass grave might be. Because I think that's an important part of this too. I mean, communities have to feel comfortable, and I would like to think that the situation in governments have advanced so much in the last 2 decades or so that we wouldn't still have to talk about issues of impunity and corruption and excessive militaries. But unfortunately, a lot hasn't changed, and so that's one thing. I mean, when we look at the cases in Mexico, I mean, the 43 students that disappeared, it's hard to believe that 43 students could just disappear and nobody knows what happened to them or where their remains are. That somebody had to see something, but yet the feeling of fear is so strong still in Mexico that people aren't coming forward. Let me ask you, I know we're in the middle of this pandemic, and that has changed everything. I mean, we do hearings like this now virtually because we're told we're not supposed to be all together. But has COVID-19 had any impact on the work that you do?
No.
Anyone?
Yeah, definitely it has had an impact. One is that the field work is basically freezed, right? We're not working on we don't have the opportunity to work on the field and to go to communities and to talk to people as before the pandemic. That is one thing. And the other impact is that there's less attention to these issues from the government perspective and even the public opinion and the media, because there seems to be new emergencies, right? So for us, it's important to say that the search must continue, even though we have a pandemic. And the other thing is that governments should still prioritize the search of the disappeared, and we also are seeing that in the case of El Salvador in particular, the pandemic context have made the military members like come in a more important role. It seems that they are more important for the government now. They are there's a militarized speech coming from the government. So for victims of the armed conflict, that this new role of military people seems like there's still people from the military in power, and that the new government is giving more space and more agenda to military people than to victims of past crimes and current victims' crimes. So I would say those are the impacts. That the narrative now in 2020, it's still giving a very protagonic role to military people and not victims from past or current crimes, which is very dangerous for non-repetitions guarantee.
And it seems like, again, if you can't do the field work, that obviously makes it almost impossible to be able to learn some of this stuff. Freddie?
Yeah, if I may, sir. One of the things that one of the impacts is that the families of the disappeared are usually the most marginalized families. So COVID is affecting them the most, probably. And we see that. Yes, the lack of being able to go to the field and do, exhumations, inhumations, take samples is definitely affecting the work. And the fact that there's less attention for this type of atrocity. However, we have been able to do a lot of lab work, and in doing so, we've been able to have 99 identifications during the pandemic process at the FAFG, which is probably some of our most productive months. What I mean by that is that we've been able to do a lot of work on our backlog a lot, right? Because this is an overwhelming issue and an overwhelming problem. We're always in the field. So not being in the field right now has worked to our benefit as far as catching up. We have also modified a couple of our processes. So for example, whereas before we would only notify family members in person, now we have began doing it through video calls. And we see that the information is important to the families. A lot of the family members are elderly, and we can't wait 6 months or a year to tell them we found their loved ones. So we've been able to do that. And we're also moving away from taking buccal swabs, as you would imagine, to taking small droplets of blood for DNA sampling. So it's definitely having an effect. There are positive things that are very specific to our organization, and mostly there's a lot of negative, which is the lack of being present. But also it's important to understand that we can mitigate this by having the information out there. So beginning information campaigns that say we have not forgotten, we are still working, we continue to work, and we'll be back as soon as we can. That's important because a lot of families might feel like we are going to leave them aside. And it's important, again, Grace mentioned trust. Everything we do is based on the trust of the families. We cannot do our work without them understanding the process, believing in the process, and trusting us.
Right. I'm going to yield to Grace for any response she has. Then I'm going to turn it over to Sheila Jackson-Lee because she has some questions. So Grace, do you have anything to add to what has been said?
Maybe just that for relatives in Mexico, even when with authorities, we used to work with this kind of platforms. The truth is that for so many years, we are the ones who made the work outside. So unfortunately, a lot of families has been going and keep doing the job because for the conditions of the environment, the places where these clandestine graves are, and the risk we have in order to criminal organizations back and take out these bones, and then we can find them again. They are still working. So there's a lot of partners that have been positive for COVID. And we worry about that. There's not another way to do the things in Mexico if it's not by the families, because if we still waiting for the government, maybe as many of our partners, maybe we can die without notice of our relatives. So
Yes, with the mic.
we have problems in the economic way, but for us the most difficult is that government is more interested about the pandemic, but this kind of human rights violations, even when the President López Obrador has says that for him and his administration, human rights and disappearance is the priority.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Sheila Jackson-Lee. I have one more question when she's done, but let me turn it over to her now.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and thank you for holding this hearing. And let me just thank you, period, for allowing me to participate on the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. You know, both of us knew Tom Lantos, worked with Tom Lantos, understood what this meant to him or the whole issue of human rights. I just feel a commitment that we can never abandon human rights in the world, no matter where it is, undone. And I can't thank the witnesses enough, but you need to know that Chairman McGovern is unwavering in his piercing through even some of our best allies or richest countries, because usually that's intimidating. Let's leave them alone. And as you heard me say, human rights in the United States is equally important. And you help us be better by providing your insight on issues such as enforced disappearance, which really can break your heart. I wanted Ms. Ortega Rubio, in your testimony, you talked about the burden on families, but you also talked about the growing organizations that have arisen through the loss, the enforced disappearance, how painful that is to have a loved one one day and just no one knows where they are the next day. So I would be interested in, and forgive me if you already spoke to this, but I'd be interested in whether El Salvador has continued to demonstrate a commitment to the search for the disappearance of individuals and has given full support to your organization. The other thing I'd appreciated, and other members of the panel need to think about this, what is the driving force behind this phenomenon of enforced disappearance? Now, we in the United States call it missing persons. We use the term sex trafficking or human trafficking, where families never see their loved ones again, never. But I'd be interested in if you think there is a further way of us working collaboratively together about this concept of enforced disappearance. So first, if you would answer the question about El Salvador's commitment to organizations like yourself, giving you full support to get your work done in the backdrop of COVID-19, but more importantly, in the ordinary times that we have, how that has been working. Ms. Ortega?
Thank you so much for your comments and questions, Congresswoman Jackson. Conabúsqueda it's a national institution, right? It's an institution that is part of the executive branch, but has the mandate to investigate the whereabouts of people who disappeared during the armed conflict in the whole country. It was created 2.5 years ago after family members pushed very hard for this and worked for many years in advocating before El Salvador and also before the United States government. So, of course, having a national mechanism, a national institution in place in El Salvador, it's good news. It's for the first time that the state of El Salvador try to address this issue. The creation of Conabúsqueda it's a recognition, it's an acknowledgement of this practice, terror policy, state policy of disappearing people. But after 2.5 years of working of Conabúsqueda, we're very happy to be in permanent dialogue with victims groups and to have international allies. But the support from the government is insufficient. So far, Conabúsqueda doesn't have the full specialized team that should be already and that should be hired. We only have half of our staff, and there are pending hiring processes that come from the government. We need to have our full team in place. And also we have a very limited budget. But I would say like the most important piece that is still missing in this mission is that the government seems to be supporting in public messages, like more giving more support to the sectors where the perpetrators belong, right? To military sectors, So a lot of perpetrators and people who still support them are in holding, in power positions, and the current government seems to be very close to them. So it doesn't seem to be enough space for victims to have their own narrative at their own acknowledge, like in a very public way. Definitely, Conabúsqueda is an answer for victims, but it's not enough just creating an institution. It's important giving all the resources for this institution to give answers. Otherwise, Conabúsqueda will become another failure, and these victims cannot wait anymore. These cases happened like 30, 40 years ago. Many victims and people who have information are dying. So there's like biological impunity taking place. So definitely this is the time to support these issues. And also it's important because in El Salvador, as in Mexico, there's current violence related to gang activity and also police brutality. And there are new cases of forced disappearances taking place. So we know that tackling impunity from the past and giving answers to victims from the past is a strong message against current cases.
Well, we want to support your organization, Cornabusca, and I want to build on what you just said because it was powerful to Grace Fernandez, because you have experienced having personally lost a loved one to a drug war in Mexico, and so I'm interested in. I want you to build on that question that I've said. What is mixed up in these forced disappearances? Because is it government corruption? Is it the raging drug war? Because we have to know in helping here in the United States where we should put our resources and/or legislation. So I'd be interested. Mexico is our immediate neighbor to the south. What actions, initiatives, or partnerships would help to restore trust? But more importantly, to speak from the perspective of your lost loved one, and of course, our sympathy to you, because as you've lost someone, maybe right now today, there's an enforced disappearance, and maybe you can tell us what you think the basis of that is and how we need to address it directly.
Thank you. Well, we as relatives are like families. We used to say that all disappearances in Mexico are forced disappearance. Why? Because even when could be disappeared by a criminal organization, if authorities doesn't investigate, doesn't search for, and they don't. Just don't do it their jobs, that means or there is acquiescence that is equal to be forced disappear. So it's true that there's a lot of criminal organizations that are very powerful, not just talking about financial, but also for power of make damage. You know, the kind of armies, the armament they have. But there's something that is happening. There's a lot of years ago that we know that Mexico, but also US, is the market or the main market for consumption of drugs. But criminals organizations, they have a lot of business that they work as trafficking people, trafficking organs, and other kind of crimes. But we can say these three is the most: drugs, traffic people, and traffic organs. So there's a lot of money, and they make that corruptions be so deep to eradicate. And impunity is what makes that corruption happen. So it's a circle that never ends, because there's a lot of money, there's a lot of corruption, and nobody pays because these crimes. So I think that I said a couple of things that Congress can do, and U.S. government can do in order to help us, like to still or to keep all those programs in the how to say sorry, in those departments of the U.S. government that by now is helping in the mechanism for SIC, or this thing they are doing in order to the justice and procure justice, you know. But also there's some, I was talking about the trials on USA, where these criminals that has been prosecutor in there, they were talking about disappeared people, but the attorney wasn't interested in that crime, so they stopped to the witness and say, no, I don't care about disappearance. I care about the drug traffic and the money traffic. So stop and return to what we're talking about. And as the Congressman McGovern says, uh, disappearance is a multiply uh, crime that it's supposed everybody in the world must be taken care about. So for relatives, it's very important to you keep an eye, but also make something in order to be able to recover those testimonies of that people. Maybe if you let me suggest, you can request a video meeting with the ambassador in Mexico, and maybe with the Mexican ambassador in the DC, or with the Mexican Foreign Affairs Minister, in order to ask them, what are you doing, what is your opinion of what is the Mexican government doing in this. But the most important thing could be that if it's possible for us to be with you, in order to could share um, what the government told you, or told to your representatives, and what is the real truth, no? And I don't know if you have any other question.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, if you would allow me just a question to Dr. Pecorcelli. I hope I got it almost right, Dr. Freddie. But thank you so very much, Ms. Fernandez. I'd like to build on this. You know, we're listening to stories of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico as well. And Doctor, you focused on whether or not the forensic apparatus was as strong as it should be, but you've heard the other witnesses talking about illegal groups and government. I use the term corruption, and obviously Grace lost her loved one to drug wars. And so as you speak to, again, what we can more effectively do on the forensic end, you know, we always like to get to the source of the problem. If we looked at this globally, and when I say that globally among the countries that you all represent, what would you characterize as the source of these forced um, um, disappearances? I remember I said that we have something called missing persons and human trafficking and others, but what would you focus on most? And again, add what you think we can be most effective in doing in the United States, and really working to be part of the solution in this phenomenon that really should end in 2020. In the 21st century, uh, families across South and Central America should not have to deal with this. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts about the forensics issue that we might be helpful in, but also the policy and the absolute ability to end this during this lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Jackson. Thank you for your question. I think the first thing is to understand that these organized criminal groups stem from the people that committed the crimes during the conflicts in Latin America. They were empowered during that time. They learned how to disappear persons during that time. So these really are a consequence of the political crimes of the conflicts and of the Cold War. And what they learned, they're now applying to illegal business practices. However, the way that they are disappearing people still continues to be very similar because, again, it's usually some of the same actors, where you have massacres, executions, human trafficking still going on. I think one of the most important ways is there is a divide in the way the U.S. Aid apparatus sees this, which I think is definitely creating an issue in the ability to support civil society and in general the search of the disappeared. And it's the way that the rule of law is put versus human rights. And you can see that in State Department, in INL versus DRL or others, where there is a lot of resources allocated to the creation of state institutions that don't necessarily work for these issues. But there's very little resources put in to conduct these human rights investigations. So I think there shouldn't be a difference between the approach, because if they work together, if these two issues, human rights and the rule of law, were seen as part of, let's see, a transitional justice maybe towards from these governments going forward, that could have quite a bit of impact. But the other is within these state institutions to really create focused efforts that understand the families and that work with the families. See, these forensic processes are a bit different than catching criminals, because here what we're trying to do is recreate what happened. As you've heard, it's very difficult to find someone who's been disappeared or someone who's missing. The difference being that someone who's disappeared, their whereabouts are being hidden from us on purpose, whereas somebody who's missing can have gone missing on their own. This is a specific effort to hide the whereabouts of the location of the living person or of the body, which means that we must understand the process that goes from either the moment that a family member reports someone disappeared or a body is found. Either one of those two is the beginning of the process. But the end of the process is not the identification. The end of the process is a dignified burial. The end of the process is the empowerment of those families so we can stop this from happening again. It's a platform for families to be able to tell these stories and tell the impact that this has, not only on the individual family, but on the community and the society overall. And with that said, it's also important that we understand that because we are neighbors, Guatemala being only one country away from the US, there's a lot of the actors of these older crimes and these newer crimes that are in the US, whether they be surviving family members or perpetrators. And that means that we might have to do some work in the US, be able to talk to family members here. And I think if we could take that into account when we're talking about immigration policy, that there are many people that should probably be welcome into the US, and there's others who maybe participated in these crimes that should not be welcome into the US. That, I think, is important to understand as we go forward in trying to eliminate these terrible crimes that continue to affect us from decades ago till today. Thank you, ma'am.
I think you've given us a real balanced response and giving us a roadmap of how we pierce into, I'd like to say, Chairman Governor, ending, because I've been in hearings like this throughout my tenure in Congress. And as I indicated, it was Congresswoman Hilda Solis, Congressman McGovern, who really worked on the young women around the border of the U.S. and Mexico that disappeared, and many different reasons were utilized. So I think we've got to find a way to really understand this and then work to penetrate the whole concept of the whole arena, if you will, of forced disappearances. So I'd like to be in touch with you, some of the members of the panel, Dr. Freddie Petrocelli. I would like to be in touch to really get an understanding of what direction I'd like to offer legislation that deals with some of the issues that you all have presented. So thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. With that, I could go on, but I do want to say to those on this panel, I did mean what I said when we have some issues here in the United States. And I think this is an appropriate forum to mention that refugees have been a pathway that the United States has taken to be a good neighbor in the world. And I'm always offended when we don't recognize that an immigration system, a refugee system, an asylum system are all part of America's humanitarian commitment to the world. And we need to uphold that as well. And Chairman McGovern, the young woman that I spoke of at the beginning, miracles happen, and this young woman who was impacted by losing her fallopian tube in that Irvine County, we've been able to secure her release. So thank you for allowing me to say that at the beginning, because it was certainly unfortunate what was happening, and you allowed me to say it on the record.
Good.
So thank you so very much. And with that, Chairman, I'm going to yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and appreciate your comments and your commitment to trying to resolve these issues. The House is about to come into session shortly, so we don't have very much time. But I do want to ask each of you, what we should be doing. What's the most important thing we can be doing here in Congress to help support the work that you're doing? And Ms. Fernandez, you mentioned perhaps meeting with the Mexican ambassador to talk about some of these stuff, and that's obviously something we can do. But I don't want this hearing to end without us having some assignments, without us doing some follow-up, because this is incredibly important. We obviously can stress to the governments in the region that this is important, but I think we need to do more. And I think we need to do more, not just because it's the right thing to do for those families whose loved ones are disappeared, but I do think that we are at a moment in U.S. history where we have to do more, at least in Congress, to try to reinforce our image as a country that is actually dedicated to human rights, because there are lots of things that are happening and being said. Ms. Jackson-Lee mentioned the treatment of refugees at our border. That have tarnished that image to a certain extent. And I don't want governments in Latin America or anywhere else in the world to interpret some of the actions of this administration as somehow meaning that we don't care about these things, that we're less committed to human rights, that we're not going to push the uncomfortable questions, because that's just not the truth. So, Ms. Fernandez, I'll begin with you. You mentioned a couple of things, and Ms. Jackson-Lee, are there any other things that you think we can do that would be helpful? Whether it's legislatively, whether it's with meetings, whether it's with statements, whether it is highlighting particular cases, how do we be wind at your back in the work that you're doing? So, Ms. Fernandez, we'll begin with you.
Well, as I said, there's a lot of things that the Congress can do, right? The foreign assistance that the U.S. government is giving with these departments and the USAID is very important for us, and more when the government by now is trying to save money, and unfortunately, the disappearance. Cost too much. Freddie knows that identifications is very expensive, and we don't have experts enough in Mexico, so we will need help from the foreign. And for example, there's a lot of universities and there's a lot of labs that work in DNA processes in USA that can help us to reach this important goal for us. But also this part that what I was talking about to make pressure to the government is very important, because when for Mexican authorities, when USA authorities, any authority of the USA ask, they immediately do. So for us, when you have the opportunity to pronounce, to send a letter, to ask an ambassador or whatever, you don't have an idea the impact that have, but the positive impact that have for our work. So that is one of my requests, but also maybe this well, I was talking about the clause of human rights in the commerce agreement. Uh, in our agreement with the European Union, we have a democratic clause that it makes that all the European Congress can ask about human rights in Mexico. But also, for example, in France, when those companies, those French companies comes and invest in Mexico, if, if they commit or they propose a human rights violation, uh, can complain with the French government. So if that could be possible with the US, will be great, because a lot of disappearances are in the context of the huge project with these multinational companies, where when they are trying to build a new plant in places where there are communities, and the Mexican government takes their land and kill a lot of people, or these kind of crimes. And there's not an easy way to say this and have justice, but also to protect these people. So this democratic clause could be good. I know by now can is not possible anymore, but it's not impossible to try to ask and being worry about what is happening with the companies that are having investment in Mexico.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, look, I mean, I think those are good suggestions, and clearly we need more money for forensic infrastructure if we're going to resolve these cases. So that I think that is important. You know, and a lot of this is political will, right? It's political will by the government of Mexico, Salvador, Guatemala, I mean, Colombia, and by the United States. I mean, and on the United States side, that means that we need to be more forthcoming with, previously classified materials that also may be helpful. I mean, Mr. Pecorelli mentioned at the beginning about a military base in Guatemala that was denied, whose existence was denied, and they discovered that it existed through, through cable traffic between, coming from the United States. So, there's a role there, but I think, we will, and the other thing on Mexico, one of the things that the Human Rights Commission should do is a more focused hearing on Mexico, and we could do that next year, and we can work with you on that. But thank you. Ms. Ortega.
Thank you. It is important to continue giving public support to the search of the disappeared, and that could take the form of even tweets or open letters, private letters, and Con la Búsqueda was made possible in part because of your support and the support of family members in the U.S. and in El Salvador. So that is still important. And at the same time, of course, allocating funds for the search of the disappeared in this in a holistic way, as Freddie was mentioning. I mean, funds for victims, for human rights organization, for forensic work, and not just for institutions, but for in a more comprehensive way. I want to thank you because in last year budget there was an earmark for Con la Búsqueda, and those funds, of course, there's a long way for those funds to actually be released and to be implemented in El Salvador. But just please keep an eye on all those procedures that has to come after earmarking some funds. Thank you. This is very important, especially in a time where in El Salvador, there's a shift for a more anti-democratic and more militarized approach. So these messages of supporting victims and remember us the importance of non-repetition is key. Thank you.
No, and thank you. And your final point about the current state of affairs in El Salvador, I think is also an important one. Look, I met with President Bukele, after he became president, and was assured that there was going to be more transparency. That in the case of the El Mozote case, there was, going to be, a cooperation with those trying to get to the truth, and have been very, very disappointed at the rhetoric and at the lack of, cooperation. And I'll just say this. I mean, some of us have raised issues, and I think maybe they may be getting assurances from the Trump administration not to worry. But I'm going to tell you they should worry, because if El Salvador's sliding backwards and moving away from democracy and undercutting democratic institutions, and militarizing things that should not be militarized, I think that's going to have a significant impact on the relationship, at least in terms of funding that El Salvador gets. And I'm just saying that because I've spent an awful lot of time in that country. First as a congressional aide during the 1980s. I worked for Congressman Moakley. We investigated the murders of the Jesuit priests. I met many human rights defenders during the 1980s who were murdered because of their advocacy. I lost a lot of friends. I care deeply about the people of El Salvador who have suffered so greatly. They deserve a lot more than they've gotten from the United States government and from their own government. But at a minimum, they deserve the truth. And so we're not going to back down. Again, I want to have a good relationship with the Bukele administration, but I'm not going to be quiet if I think they're moving in a direction that, quite frankly, is dangerous. So thank you for what you're doing, and we will hopefully we will find an easier way to support Con la Búsqueda, as we move forward. And last but not least, Mr. Pecorelli, I will yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My suggestions would be, like I mentioned, maybe a public outreach campaign in the U.S. There's a lot of family members here that also have a lot of family members back in our countries, and to, like Leonora mentioned, maybe some tweets, maybe make this enforced disappearances a current issue, which it is, but coming from Congress would be really important. As far as
Maybe we can work with you and Lenore and Ms. Fernandez about what that would look like, right? I mean, how
yes,
in a way that so it's. I mean, because we could tweet something, but I mean, but I think we need a more coordinated effort. So maybe we can think about what that actually would look like, this outreach effort, and we can work with you on that.
Wonderful, sir. As far as Guatemala, I have to suggest a high-level visit to Guatemala from maybe yourself or other members of Congress to speak specifically about this issue with our fairly new president. And I think this issue has been pushed aside. Some of the organizations, institutions created during the peace accords have now been disbanded or completely absorbed by other institutions, and continuing along that path of transitional justice seems to have gone astray in this current government. Insisting on the release of the military archives, I think is important, because our work would be made easier if we knew who was taken into these military bases or where all of the military bases in the country were, for example, but also on the side of the guerrilla as well. We're trying to identify everyone who's disappeared from the conflict, and currently as well. As far as El Salvador, I will say that I have to suggest the creation of a human identification center that focuses on the search of the disappeared and that can manage a large family DNA database. And I do have a model, which is the model that Coahuila, where Grace is using. Coahuila has just established a human identification center that is part of the local search commission, and that is going to be working with the commission and have autonomy to be able to respond directly to the commission. We're also working with them, and what I see is the first effort of such a center at the service of the families and at the service of the search commission. So if we can begin to think of something like that for El Salvador, it would be, I think, of great benefit to the search.
Thank you very much. Those are all good suggestions, and we will follow up with you on all these ideas. And let me just say, I look forward to visiting, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, and other countries in the region as soon as we can. I mean, we have to get through this pandemic, I guess, to the point where, we can all safely travel and see what we want to see. But in the meantime, we can certainly talk to government officials directly, and we can certainly be advocating for funding and finding ways to raise the profile of this issue. And like I said, we have a large, Salvadoran and Guatemalan and Mexican diaspora in the United States, and I've talked to countless families whose loved ones have been disappeared, and it is heartbreaking, and it's doubly heartbreaking when they don't know what happened and when they don't even know where they are. And I think we all can change that reality if we had the political will to do so. And so what I'm pledging to all of you is that I want to work very closely with you to make sure we get to the point that we all want to get to. And so this has been very, very helpful. And again, I applaud the work that all of you are doing. And I know, by the way, it's also potentially dangerous work because there are people out there who do not want you to locate the remains of the disappeared. but it is so important. You know, you can't get reconciliation, you can't get to forgiveness, you can't get to a new day unless you deal with the truth, unless you resolve issues like this. And so, so thank you, and I wish you all well. Please be safe, and we will be in touch. This hearing has come to a close. Thank you.
Thank you very much.